The first thing you notice is the scent. It is not one single smell, but a complex layering of aromas. At the base is the cold, sterile perfume of marble and cedarwood. Over this lies the cloying sweetness of spilled wine, exotic incense, and the heavy fragrance of lilies beginning to turn. And beneath it all, almost imperceptible, is the faint, animalize tang of sweat and unbridled exertion. The laughter from the adjoining triclinium is too loud, the lyre music a fraction too fast, as if striving to maintain a gaiety that is both desperate and brittle. You keep your eyes fixed on the mosaic floor, on the intricate depiction of a writhing sea serpent, because to look up is to risk catching an eye to be noticed, and to be noticed by the mistress of this house is to be pulled into the orbit of her chaotic gravity, a place from which few return unscathed. She is young, impossibly so, yet she moves through these halls with the predatory assurance of a creature that has never known fear or denial. You are a slave in the household of Valeria Messalina. This feeling of absolute dependency, of being an object in another's world, is central to understanding the power dynamics of ancient Rome. So, before we open the official archives, take a moment to add your mark to our own record with a like and subscribe. But only if you're truly committed to examining the evidence, no matter how grim. In the comments below, share your thoughts on which historical figure you believe has been most profoundly misunderstood by posterity. And now the preamble is over. Let us turn to the primary sources and begin the slow work of reconstruction. Our subject, Valeria Messalina, was born into the highest echelons of Roman society around the year 20 AD. Her lineage was impeccable, a tapestry woven from the most powerful threads of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Her paternal grandmother was Claudia Marcellamina, a granddaughter of Augustus's own sister Octavia. Through another line, she was a direct descendant of the tree of Marc Antony. Her mother, Domitian Lepida the Younger, was a great niece of Augustus himself. In the intricate and perilous ecosystem of the imperial family, Messalina was a specimen of the purest aristocratic blood. This was not a matter of mere prestige. It was a political asset of immense value. A woman of her standing was a vessel for alliances, a means of perpetuating the sacred bloodline that was seen as essential to the stability of the Roman state. Her early life is, as is common for most Roman women of the era, largely unrecorded. We can surmise she received the education typical for a girl of her class: literature, music, and the complex management of a large aristocratic household. But more importantly, she would have been educated in the unspoken language of power. She would have observed firsthand the paranoid and decadent court of the Emperor Gaius, known to history as Caligula, a cousin on her mother's side. She would have learned early that favor was fleeting, that survival depended on calculated alliances, and that proximity to the throne was both a shield and a target. Around the year 38 AD, when Messalina was approximately 18 years old, a marriage was arranged for her. Her husband B was Tiberius Claudius Nero Germanicus. At the time, this was not the spectacular match it would later become. Claudius was nearly 50 years old, a man more than twice her age. He was the brother of the celebrated hero Germanicus and the nephew of the former Emperor Tiberius, but he had been systematically excluded from public life for decades. A limp, a slight stammer, and what his family derided as a lack of social grace, he was widely regarded as a scholarly recluse, a harmless eccentric kept on the periphery of the imperial court. To Caligula, he was a figure of ridicule, a court jester to be mocked and belittled. The marriage, therefore, was a purely strategic arrangement. For Claudius, it was a vital connection to a younger, fertile, and centrally important branch of the Julio-Claudian family tree, enhancing his own dynastic standing. For Messalina's family, it represented a secure, if unglamorous, alliance with a senior member of the imperial house. There is no historical record to suggest any element of romance or personal affection in the union. It was a transaction, a political merger designed to consolidate influence and ensure continuity. For Messalina, it was the fulfillment of her dynastic duty. Within a year of the marriage, she fulfilled that duty in the most concrete way possible. In approximately 39 AD, she gave birth to a daughter, Claudia Octavia. 2 years later, in 41 AD, she bore a son, Tiberius Claudius Germanicus. who would later be known by the honorific Britannicus. By providing a male heir, Messalina had performed the single most important function of an imperial consort. She had secured the succession and solidified her husband's lineage. She was simply another high-minded-born Roman matron, fulfilling her expected role within the rigid confines of the aristocracy. She was the wife of a seemingly irrelevant old man and the mother of his children. Few could have predicted that a sudden bloody coup was about to shatter this reality and thrust her, and her unassuming husband, into the absolute center of the Roman world. The precipitating event occurred on January 24th, 41 AD. The Emperor Caligula was attending the Palatine Games, a series of performances and athletic contests held in honor of the deified Augustus. For months, a conspiracy had been coalescing against him, fueled by his increasingly erratic behavior, his open contempt for the Senate, and his personal insults directed at key military officers. The principal architects of this plot were members of his own Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with his protection. The leaders were Cassius C. Chaerea, a tribune whom Caligula frequently mocked for his supposedly effeminate voice, and Cornelius Sabinus. They were not acting in a vacuum. They had the tacit support of several influential senators who dreamed of restoring the old republic. As Caligula left the theater to proceed to a midday meal, he entered a secluded palace passageway. It was there that the conspirators struck. According to the historical accounts, C.A. Chaerea delivered the first blow, followed by Sabinus and other guardsmen. The assassination was swift and brutal. The chaos that ensued was total. In the immediate aftermath, a separate detachment of guards, loyal to the conspirators' wife, Miloen Iaca Sonia, and their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, both were killed without hesitation, a clinical and ruthless act designed to extinguish the emperor's direct line and prevent any future claims to the throne. The city of Rome was plunged into a state of extreme uncertainty. The Senate, sensing an opportunity, began to convene, with members openly debating the abolition of the prince, a Praetorian Guard rule of the Republic. The Praetorian Guard, however, had no interest in such a restoration. Their power, their elevated pay, and their very purpose were intrinsically tied to the existence of an emperor. While the senators debated, the Praetorians acted. It was during this period of confusion that a group of guardsmen, sweeping through the imperial palace, made a discovery that would alter the course of Roman history. Hiding in a state of terror, concealed behind a heavy curtain, was Messalina's husband, Claudius. The historical sources, particularly Suetonius, paint a picture of a man convinced he was about to be executed along with the rest of his family. The soldiers, far from killing him, recognized him as the brother of the beloved Germanicus and the last adult male of the Julio-Claudian house. In a moment of improvisation, they saw him not as a target but as a solution. He was a legitimate heir, yet perceived as weak and pliable, the perfect candidate for a puppet emperor who would be indebted to the military that installed him. Claudius was hurried from his hiding place and taken to the Praetorian camp, the heavily fortified barracks just outside the city walls. There, he was formally acclaimed as emperor by the assembled troops. The decision was not political. It was a corporate act of self-preservation by the Praetorian Guard, who secured from Claudius a promise of a massive donative, a cash bonus for every soldier, in exchange for their loyalty. The Senate, still deliberating, was presented with a fait accompli. Their theoretical discussions were rendered moot by the reality of military force. With the Praetorians united behind Claudius, the senators had no choice but to formally ratify his accession. For Messalina, this sequence of events represented a transformation of staggering proportions. One moment, she was the 21-year-old wife of a ridiculed imperial relative. The next, she was the empress of the Roman world. Her status, her influence, and her potential power had magnified beyond comprehension overnight. Her children were no longer simply members of a sporadic clan. They were the designated heirs to the most powerful throne in the known world. Her Octavia was now a princess of unimaginable strategic value in future marriage alliances. Her infant son, Britannicus, was the living symbol of the new regime's continuity and legitimacy. This sudden elevation, however, was built on a foundation of extreme precarity. Claudius's reign was born of assassination and military coup. He had been imposed upon a reluctant Senate and owed his position entirely to the Praetorian Guard, an entity he would have to continuously appease. He lacked the military prestige of his predecessors and was plagued by the perception of being a weak, accidental emperor. This inherent instability created an atmosphere of intense paranoia at the heart of the new court. Threats, both real and perceived, lurked in every shadow. For Messalina, her newfound power was inextricably linked to the survival of this fragile regime. It was a climate that would reward ruthlessness, encourage preemptive action, and place an extraordinary premium on the security of the direct imperial line, a security that she, as the emperor's wife and the mother of his heir, was uniquely positioned to control and manipulate. The court that formed around the Emperor Claudius was unlike any that had preceded it. It was a structure defined by its contradictions. Immense power wielded by a man perceived as weak, rigid official hierarchies subverted by informal influence, and a veneer of restored tradition overlaying a deep current of paranoia and fear. Claudius himself was an enigma. He was a diligent administrator and a serious scholar, genuinely interested in law and history. Yet, his physical ailments and social awkwardness, long derided by his family, made him appear indecisive and easily swayed in the eyes of the Roman elite. This perception of malleability created a power vacuum around the throne, a space that was immediately filled by ambitious and capable individuals who understood the true levers of imperial administration. The most significant of these new power brokers were the imperial freedmen. In previous reigns, freedmen, former slaves who had been granted their freedom, had served in administrative roles, but under Claudius, they rose to unprecedented heights of influence. Three figures came to dominate the court. Narcissus, who held the post of epistulus, secretary for correspondence. Pallas, the Irrationibus, secretary of the treasury. And Callistus, the Libellus, secretary for petitions and judicial inquiries. Together they controlled the flow of information to and from the emperor, managed the vast finances of the empire, and influenced the course of justice. They were, in effect, a cabinet of ministers. Their power was immense, but it was entirely personal, derived solely from their relationship with Claudius. This made them fiercely loyal to the emperor's survival, but also created intense resentment among the traditional aristocracy. The senators, men from ancient and noble families, were forced to carry favor with individuals they considered their social inferiors, men who had once been property. This simmering hostility from the Senate was not merely a matter of social snobbery. It was a genuine political threat. Many senators had supported the assassination of Caligula in the hope of restoring the Republic. Claudius's accession, imposed by the military, was a deep humiliation. In 42 AD, this opposition manifested in open rebellion. The governor of Dalmatia, Lucius Auranius Camillus Scribon Eunice, was persuaded by several senators to revolt and declare himself emperor. The uprising was poorly planned and quickly collapsed when his own legions refused to follow him, but it served as a stark confirmation of the dangers facing the new regime. It proved that there were powerful men willing to risk civil war to unseat Claudius. The response from the Claudian court was swift and brutal. A wave of treason trials and purges swept through the ranks of the Senate and the equestrian order. The historical accounts, while prone to exaggeration, paint a grim picture. Suetonius claims that during his reign, Claudius ordered the execution of 35 senators and more than 300 equestrians. While the precise numbers are debatable, the political climate they reflect is not. The political climate they reflect is not, and constant surveillance. An ill-misjudged comment, a forgotten ancestor's political affiliation, or the ambition of a rival could be enough to trigger an investigation and a death sentence. Fear became the dominant currency of political life. This atmosphere of mortal peril was paradoxically paired with a culture of extreme decadence. The imperial treasury, refilled after the excesses of Caligula, was vast. Claudius, seeking to bolster his legitimacy and popularity, sponsored lavish public works, including the construction of a new port at Ostia and the completion of two major aqueducts. He also staged extravagant gladiatorial games and public spectacles. This immense wealth permeated the court, fostering an environment where favors were bought and sold, and influence was traded for exorbitant bribes. The freedmen amassed personal fortunes that rivaled the treasuries of foreign kings. Into this treacherous ecosystem stepped Empress Messalina. She was not a peripheral figure but a central player in this new and dangerous game. As the wife of the emperor and mother of the heir, Britannicus, her status was inextricably linked to the survival of Claudius. Any threat to him was a direct threat to her and her children. Unlike the freedmen, whose power was based on administrative skill, or the senators whose influence came from lineage, Messalina's power was dynastic and biological. She was the vessel of the imperial succession. In a court riddled with conspiracies and governed by fear, this position gave her both immense leverage and profound vulnerability. She quickly learned that in the Claudian court, power was not a static possession but something that had to be actively, and often ruthlessly, defended and expanded. The power vested in Messalina was, at its core, biological. It was embodied in the two children she had born Claudius. Her daughter, Claudia Octavia, born around 39 AD, was a strategic asset of immense worth. In the dynastic calculus of the Roman Empire, an imperial princess was a tool for forging alliances. Her eventual marriage could be used to bind a powerful general to the throne, to reward a loyal senatorial family, or to pacify a rival faction. She represented a future promise of stability and continuity. But it was her son, Tiberius Claudius Germanicus, born just weeks after his father's unexpected accession in 41 AD, who was the true anchor of the new regime. He was the heir, the living proof that the Claudian Principate was not a temporary aberration but the beginning of a new dynasty. Claudius understood this perfectly. He doted on the infant boy, who was soon given the honorific title Britannicus to celebrate his father's successful invasion of Britain in 43 AD. The emperor would frequently present his son to the Praetorian guards, holding him up and commending him to their loyalty. He paraded him before the Roman people at the games. These were not merely acts of fatherly affection. They were calculated political theatre. Each public appearance of Britannicus reinforced the legitimacy of Claudius's rule and designated a clear line of succession, a powerful deterrent against potential usurpers who might otherwise seek Claudius's age and perceived weakness as an invitation to conspiracy. Messalina's primary political function, therefore, was to act as the ultimate guardian of these two dynastic assets. Her own survival, and the immense power she now wielded, depended entirely on Britannicus one day succeeding his father. Any individual who could present a plausible alternative claim to the throne was, by definition, a mortal threat not just to the state, but to her personally, in the paranoid atmosphere of the court. This defensive mandate quickly evolved into a proactive and ruthless strategy of elimination. Messalina's first targets were not external enemies of Rome, but members of her own extended family. Claudius, upon his accession, had made a show of clemency by recalling his two nieces, Julia Livia, from the exile imposed upon them by their brother, Caligula. From Messalina's perspective, this was a catastrophic error in judgment. Both women were daughters of the university-beloved Germanicus. They possessed the blood of Augustus and a direct connection to a military hero. Agrippina in particular had a young son, Lucius Domitius Aecinobarbus, the future Emperor Nero, who represented another potential male heir with a powerful lineage. The first to be targeted was Julia Livia. The ancient historians Tacitus and Cassius Dio both report that Messalina developed an intense animosity toward her. The reasons cited are a mixture of personal jealousy over her beauty and influence with Claudius, and cold political calculation. Julia Livia was seen as too close to the emperor, a potential rival for his affections and, more importantly, his political trust. The chosen weapon was a familiar one in Roman political struggles, a charge of adultery. The empress accused Julia Livia of having an illicit affair with the noted Stoic philosopher and writer, Seneca the Younger. There is no way to verify the truth of this accusation. Adultery, particularly for women of the imperial family, was legally classified as treason, making it a convenient and potent charge. Claudius, seemingly convinced by his wife's allegations or unwilling to oppose her, acted decisively. Seneca was exiled to the island of Corsica. Julia Livilla was banished to the desolate island of Pandateria, the same location where other disgraced women of the imperial family had been sent to perish. She did not last long. Within a year, she was dead, allegedly starved to death on Messalina's orders. Another potential threat was also neutralized around the same period. This was Julia, the daughter of Claudius's own son Drusus from his first marriage. As the emperor's granddaughter, she too possessed a claim, however distant, that could theoretically be exploited by a conspiratorial faction. According to Suetonius, Messalina, working in concert with an unnamed accuser, brought forward charges against her. Claudius once again appears to have acquiesced. This Julia was executed without a public trial. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were systematic, clinical purges of the dynastic field. Messalina was methodically pruning the Claudian family tree, removing any branch that could potentially challenge the primacy of her own son Britannicus. She was ensuring that when people looked at the future of the imperial house, they would see only one possible heir. In doing so, she was consolidating her own power. She demonstrated to the court her absolute influence over the emperor and her willingness to use lethal force to protect her position. The empress was establishing herself not merely as a consort, but as the fiercely protective and dangerous matriarch of the ruling dynasty. Having secured the direct line of succession by eliminating potential dynastic rivals, Messalina's focus began to expand. Her influence was no longer purely defensive, aimed at protecting her son's inheritance. It became an offensive instrument for the acquisition of wealth and the removal of any individual, regardless of their family ties, who was perceived as a political obstacle or possessed something she desired. The apparatus of the state, its prosecutors, its courts, and its capacity for lethal violence was increasingly repurposed to serve her personal ambitions. The most illustrative case of this shift was the downfall of Valerius Asiaticus in 47 AD. Asiaticus was one of the most powerful men in Rome. He was immensely wealthy, a 2-time consul, and hailed from Gaul, reflecting the broadening base of the Roman elite. Crucially, he had been a key figure in the conspiracy against Caligula and had commanded legions along the Rhine, giving him significant military prestige and a network of loyal soldiers. According to the account of Tacitus, Messalina's motives for targeting him were twofold. First, she coveted his property, specifically the magnificent gardens of Lucullus, one of the most opulent private estates in Rome. Second, she feared his political influence and his potential to lead a faction against the emperor. The plot against him was a masterclass in the political machinations of the Claudian court. Messalina employed a notorious prosecutor, Aelius Rufus, to bring the charges. The empress herself allegedly had a personal rivalry with Poppaeus Urbina the Elder, a celebrated beauty of the era and the mother of the future empress of the same name. Messalina accused Poppaea of being Asiaticus's mistress. This charge of adultery, while damaging, was merely the prelude to the far more serious accusation that Asiaticus was using his influence with the German legions to plot a coup d'état. The trial was not held in a public court before the Senate, but was conducted privately, within the confines of the imperial palace. This was a hallmark of Claudian justice, where the emperor, advised by his inner circle, acted as judge. Claudius presided, with Messalina seated beside him. The outcome was all but predetermined. Asiaticus defended himself with considerable eloquence, and for a moment, it seemed he might sway the famously suggestible emperor. Tacitus reports that Claudius was visibly moved by his defense. At this critical juncture, Messalina intervened. She allegedly left the room and, through an intermediary, the corrupt freedman Vitellius, father of a future emperor, warned Claudius that while the accused should be granted the mercy of choosing his own manner of death, he must not be acquitted. The emperor, swayed by his wife and advisers, complied. Asiaticus was informed of the verdict. He was not to be publicly executed, but was permitted to take his own life, a privilege of the Roman elite, but allowed his property, in theory, to pass to his heirs. His final words, as recorded by Tacitus, were a bitter lament not for his life, but for the fact that his treasured gardens would fall into the hands of the empress. He opened his own veins and bled to death. The destruction of Asiaticus did not end there. His alleged mistress, Poppaea Sabina the Elder, was also targeted. Driven to despair by the threat of prosecution and imprisonment, she too committed suicide. The affair sent a shockwave through the Roman aristocracy. It demonstrated that no amount of wealth, status, or past service to the state could protect an individual from the empress's lethal combination of greed and political paranoia. This consolidation of power was not conducted by Messalina in a vacuum. She often operated in a symbiotic alliance with the powerful imperial freedmen Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus. They shared a common interest in weakening the old senatorial aristocracy, which viewed them with contempt. By eliminating powerful senators like Asiaticus, they removed potential threats to Claudius's regime and, by extension, to their own position. They also enriched themselves and the state treasury through the confiscation of their victims' estates. Messalina provided the imperial sanction and the dynastic imperative for these purges, while the freedmen provided the administrative and legal machinery to carry them out. For a time, their interests were perfectly aligned, creating a formidable and merciless power bloc at the very center of the Roman Empire. Anyone who fell afoul of this group faced a coordinated and inescapable assault. The accumulation of absolute power, particularly when acquired rapidly and held without the traditional constraints of political experience, often serves not as an end in itself, but as a license. For Messalina, the successful elimination of dynastic and political rivals created a zone of impunity around her person. Having established her dominance in the political sphere, her appetites reportedly began to manifest in the personal. The first indications that the empress's conduct was transgressing the rigid moral boundaries expected of a Roman matron did not emerge from the public squares or taverns of Rome, but from within the marble corridors of the imperial palace itself. The Palatine Hill was a self-contained world, a sprawling complex of staterooms, private residences, temples, and gardens. It was populated by a vast and stratified society of senators, equally thousands of slaves. It was an environment of constant observation, where every glance, every conversation, and every clandestine meeting was noted and catalogued by an army of unseen eyes and ears. It was here, in this gilded cage, that the initial whispers about Messalina's personal conduct began to circulate. These were not yet tales of public scandal, but of indiscretions contained within the elite circles of the court. The historical sources, primarily Tacitus and Cassius Dio, allege that the empress began to pursue affairs with a number of handsome and influential men within the palace. One of the earliest and most consequential cases involved Appius Junius Silenus, a man of consular rank and distinguished lineage. According to the narrative, Messalina became infatuated with him and made repeated advances, all of which he rebuffed, likely out of a prudent fear of the emperor's potential wrath. Allegedly curdled into a lethal form of vengeance. In a scheme of remarkable audacity, Messalina conspired with the powerful freedman Narcissus. They coordinated their stories and, in the early hours of the morning, burst into Claudius's bedchamber in a state of manufactured terror. They each claimed to have had the exact same dream, that Silenus was poised to assassinate the emperor. Claudius, a man described by ancient historians as being perpetually anxious and susceptible to suggestion, was terrified. Without seeking further evidence or convening a trial, he ordered Silenus's immediate execution. The man was killed that very day. The event served a dual purpose for Messalina. It eliminated a man who had slighted her and sent an unambiguous message to the rest of the court about the fatal consequences of refusing her attentions. An equally revealing incident involved a celebrated pantomime actor named Mesta. In Roman society, actors, despite their popularity, were infamous people of low legal and social standing. An affair with such a man would have been a profound breach of aristocratic decorum. The sources claim that Messalina developed an obsession with Mesta, but he, like Silenus, initially refused her. Fearing the inevitable repercussions, reveals the extraordinary degree of Messalina's manipulative power over her husband. She allegedly complained to Claudius, not about a spurned romantic advance, but about a supposed act of insubordination. She claimed that Mesta was refusing to follow her commands, framing it as a matter of a servant disobeying the empress. Claudius, having no inkling of the true nature of these commands, summoned the actor. He then personally ordered Nestor to obey his wife in all things. With the emperor's own authority now sanctioning the affair, Nestor had no choice but to comply. Messalina had weaponized her husband's ignorance, turning his imperial power into an instrument for her own sexual gratification. These palace-bound affairs represented more than simple libidinal indulgence. They were demonstrations of power. By compelling the submission of high-ranking senators and popular celebrities, Messalina was subverting the patriarchal structure of Roman society. She was taking on the traditional male prerogative of sexual license and exercising it with a ruthlessness that underscored her unique position of influence. The whispers among the palace slaves and courtiers would have been a mixture of fear, awe, and condemnation. They were witnessing the empress not merely breaking the rules, but rewriting them for her own benefit. For the time being, these transgressions were contained within the palace walls, a secret known only to the inner circle. But this containment was not destined to last. To understand the events that followed, it is necessary to analyze the very nature of the environment in which Messalina lived. The imperial palace on the Palatine Hill was not merely a residence. It was a self-contained ecosystem, a symbol of the emperor's power, and a prison of suffocating formality. While it offered access to unimaginable luxury and influence, it also imposed psychological pressures. It was, in the most literal sense, a gilded cage, and its constraints were as formidable as its privileges. The life of an empress was a highly ritualized and public performance. Messalina was expected to embody the traditional ideal of the Roman matrone on a monumental scale. This archetype demanded dignity, modesty, and a steadfast devotion to her husband and family. Her public appearances were carefully managed. Her clothing, her comportment, and her attendants were all meant to project an image of imperial stability and virtue. She was the mother of the heir, a living symbol of the dynasty's future, and her every action was scrutinized for its political implications. There was no true privacy. Every room had slaves, every corridor had guards, and every courtier was a potential observer, informant, or rival. This constant, unblinking scrutiny created a profound disconnect between her public role and her private reality. The power she wielded was immense but also fundamentally derivative. It existed only as a reflection of her husband's authority. She could orchestrate the downfall of a powerful senator, but she could not walk the streets of Rome as an ordinary woman. She could acquire vast fortunes, but this wealth served only to reinforce the opulent prison in which she lived. Of possessing limitless power but suffering from a complete lack of personal autonomy is central to understanding her subsequent behavior. Furthermore, the very nature of her power may have led to a peculiar form of existential ennui. When every desire can be met, when every whim is catered to, the act of wanting itself can lose its meaning. The affairs conducted within the palace, while a transgression of Roman moral codes, were still executed within her own sphere of control. She was always the empress. The men she took as lovers, whether through seduction, coercion, or imperial command, were always aware of her identity. The power dynamic was never in question. These encounters, therefore, could not offer a genuine escape from the self. They were merely an extension of the same imperial will she exercised in the political arena. Psychologically, this may have created an imperative for a more radical form of escape. Not just an escape from the moral constraints of her role, but from the role itself. The need to experience a world where her identity was stripped away, where her power was irrelevant, and where interactions were unmediated by status and fear. Anonymity, a state utterly alien to the most famous woman in the empire, may have become the ultimate, unobtainable luxury, to be seen not as Messalina the empress, but as a mere body, subject to the same base transactions as the lowest members of society, could represent a profound, if perverse, form of liberation. This desire to shed the imperial persona would have been amplified by the constant, life minus or minus death pressure of her position. The Claudian court was a world of perpetual intrigue. Her survival and, but of her children depended on her ability to constantly anticipate threats, manage alliances, and project an aura of unassailable power. This ceaseless calculation, this unending political chess match, would have been mentally and emotionally exhausting. in this context, an escape into a world of pure, unthinking physicality, a world devoid of political consequence and intellectual maneuvering, could have served as a necessary psychological release valve. It was a flight from the complex burdens of the mind into the simple, brutal realities of the flesh. The palace had become a stage, and she was trapped in a leading role she had not chosen. The affairs within its walls were simply improvisations within the existing script. What she seemingly began to crave was a way to leave the theatre altogether, even if only for a few hours in the dead of night. The psychological imperative for escape, once it took root, required a practical methodology. A mere whim could not transport the Empress of Rome beyond the guarded confines of the Palatine. The transformation had to be a deliberate, calculated act of self-erasure, a ritualized shedding of one identity to assume another. This process, as described by the ancient chroniclers, began after the Emperor Claudius had fallen asleep, a state often aided by the copious amounts of wine he was known to consume at dinner. The first step was the physical metamorphosis. The symbols of her imperial station were systematically removed. The fine silk stole, the traditional garment of a respectable Roman matron, dyed with the prized Asterian purple that signified her rank, was exchanged for the coarse, dark wool of a commoner. The intricate hairstyle, a complex architecture of braids and curls, held in place by golden pins and maintained by a team of specialized slaves, was undone. In its place, according to the poet Juvenal, she would don a simple hood or, at times, a cheap, blonde wig. See alien drum, a common marker of a prostitute in Rome, intended to mimic the appearance of women from Gaul or Germany. Her jewelry, the pearls and emeralds that were the treasury of the state made manifest on her person, was locked away. Even the distinctive scent of her expensive perfumes would have been scrubbed off, replaced by the anonymity of the unwashed city air. In a matter of minutes, the Empress Valeria Messalina would vanish, and in her place would stand a nameless plebeian woman. To complete this transformation, she adopted an alias. The name she allegedly chose was Lycisca. This was not a random or meaningless pseudonym. It was laden with a brutal and explicit significance. Lycisca translates roughly to she-wolf girl or little she-wolf. The Latin word for a female wolf is lupa, and in the slang of the Roman streets, lupa was the single most common and derogatory term for a prostitute. The place where they worked, the brothel, was a lupa, literally, a wolf den. By calling herself Lycisca, Messalina was not merely adopting a disguise. She was embracing the roughest, most animalistic terminology for the role she intended to play. It was a name that stripped away all pretense of romance or seduction, reducing the act to its most carnal and commercial form. This nightly disappearing act could not have been accomplished alone. An empress was never truly by herself. Her movements were attended and monitored by a host of servants. The sources suggest she had at least one accomplice, a trusted handmaid who was privy to the secret. This individual would have been responsible for procuring the disguise, guarding the empress's chambers to ensure no one entered while she was gone, and assisting in her transformation upon her return before dawn. The loyalty of such a servant would have to be absolute, secured either by extraordinary reward or by the terrifying knowledge that a single misplaced word would mean a swift and silent death. This small conspiracy of two was the essential logistical hub for the entire operation. With the disguise in place and her identity concealed, the final step was the physical exit from the palace. This was perhaps the most perilous part of the entire endeavor. The Palatine was not a civilian residence. It was a military compound, patrolled day and night by detachments of the Praetorian Guard. However, Messalina, as the Empress, would have possessed an intimate knowledge of the palace's layout, its servant passages, its forgotten postern gates, its unmonitored garden exits. The guards were stationed to keep threats out and to protect the imperial family within. Their operational mindset would not have been calibrated to detect the Empress herself, disguised as a common slave girl, actively trying to sneak out. Slipping past the sentries, she would descend from the opulent heights of the Palatine Hill and enter the sleeping city. It was a descent in every sense of the word, from light into darkness, from order into chaos, from the apex of the social pyramid to its very foundation. Her destination was the teeming, labyrinthine heart of Rome, a place where the lives of the powerful were a distant abstraction and survival was a daily, visceral struggle. She was leaving the world she commanded to enter a world where she could be commanded, a shadow moving with purpose toward the city's notorious districts of vice. The descent from the Palatine Hill was a journey through the stratified geology of Roman society itself. Leaving behind the manicured gardens, the colonnade porticos, and the silent, imposing marble facades, her path would have led her down into the valley that separated the city's most prestigious hills. Her destination was the district known as the Sub-URA. Geographically and socially, the Sub-URA was the antithesis of the Palatine. It was a dense, low-lying basin, a floodplain for the Tiber's overflows and a catchment for the city's teeming underclass. To enter the Sub-URA at night was to step into the roaring, chaotic engine room of the Roman metropolis. The air itself changed. The clean, intense, scented atmosphere of the palace was replaced by a thick, almost tangible miasma. It was a compoundless workshops and charcoal braziers, the stench of rotting refuse piled in the alleyways, the sharp odor of human waste from overflowing latrines, and the smells of cheap food, fried fish, roasting meats, fermenting grains, all mingled into a single, overwhelming sensory signature. This was the smell of a million people living in brutally close quarters, a smell of life at its most raw and unsanitized. The silence of the imperial grounds gave way to a constant, low roar. The Sub-URA never truly slept. Its narrow, winding streets, paved and slick with filth, were a torrent of activity. From the taverns came the sounds of drunken arguments and coarse laughter. The rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer might still be heard from a workshop, where an artisan toiled through the night to meet a deadline. Men shouted in a dozen different languages, the dialects of Italy mixed with the guttural tones of Gaul, the sibilant speech of Syria, the clipped phrases of Egyptian sailors. Above it all was the ambient hum of a densely packed population, a sound that the respectable parts of the city only knew during the clamor of midday. Visually, the district was a labyrinth. The streets were canyons carved between towering, shoddily constructed apartment blocks known as insul. These buildings, often 5 or 6 stories high, were made of cheap timber and mud minus brick, and they leaned against one another for support, their upper floors jutting out over the street and blocking what little moonlight might have penetrated the city smog. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the flickering, greasy light of oil lamps hanging over the doorways of shops and bars, or the occasional torch carried by a wealthy man's entourage. For a solitary woman like the disguised Messalina, these shadows were both a shield, preserving her anonymity, and a constant source of menace. The Sub-URA was famously dangerous. It was the haunt of cutthroats, thieves, and petty criminals. The city's night watch, the vigiles, functioned more as a fire brigade than a police force, and their patrols rarely ventured deep into the most notorious parts of this district. Disputes were settled not by law, but by knives. A poorly dressed individual, alone and seemingly without protection, would have been a natural target for robbery or violence. Her decision to enter this world, and to do so repeatedly, speaks to a psychological state that transcended mere thrill-seeking. It was an embrace of genuine, mortal risk. This environment, however, offered her one thing the palace never could: perfect anonymity. On the Palatine, she was the single most identifiable woman in the world. In the Sub-URA, she was just another face in a churning river of humanity, her features obscured by the dark lineage or political standing. Status was determined by immediate practical concerns: physical strength, the jingle of coins, the sharpness of one's wits. This radical erasure of her identity was precisely the escape she sought. Her journey into this squalor was not a mistake or a misstep. It was a pilgrimage. She was moving with intent through the city's underworld, heading for a specific type of establishment that represented the district's most infamous trade. Her destination in the Sub-URA was an establishment known as a Lupa Nal. These were the official, state-sanctioned brothels of Rome, and they were an integrated, if officially despised, part of the city's social fabric. Finding one would not have been difficult. They were often marked with explicit signage. A carved phallus, a symbol of the god Priapus, might be embedded in the wall above a doorway. Terracotta lamps, molded into erotic shapes, were another common indicator. These were not advertisements in the modern sense, but simple, unambiguous symbols, a visual language understood by all strata of Roman society. The exterior of a typical lupa NAR was deliberately unassuming. It would have been indistinguishable from the other grimy storefronts or the entrances to the crowded apartment blocks that lined the street. There was no grandeur, no attempt to entice. The door would be heavy, thick wood, designed to muffle the sounds from within and to be barred against the frequent violence of the surrounding district. To cross the threshold was to leave the relative chaos of the street for a different, more structured form of degradation. The interior was a space engineered for a single purpose, with all considerations of comfort or aesthetics stripped away. The layout of the Lupa NAR of Pompeii, the most well-minus preserved example, provides a clear archaeological blueprint. Upon entering, a client would find themselves in a central corridor or a small vestibule. The air would be thick with the smoke of cheap oil lamps, the smell of unwashed bodies, stale wine, and perhaps a coarse, heavy perfume used to mask the underlying odors. The lighting was minimal, designed to obscure the squalor of the surroundings and the identities of the patrons. Here, in this main area, presided the brothel minus keeper, the Leno, or more commonly, the Lina. This figure, often a freed woman herself, managed the establishment's grim commerce. The prostitutes, the lupi, would be displayed for the client's inspection. They were typically slaves, often captured in war from distant provinces, or impoverished Roman citizens who had fallen into debt and been forced into this life. Their legal status was that of infamiae, a formal designation of disgrace that stripped them of most civil rights. The transaction was starkly commercial. Prices were fixed and often displayed. To facilitate commerce and avoid the direct exchange of imperial currency for illicit services, some establishments may have used special tokens known as spin triae. These small bronze or brass coins, stamped with erotic scenes on one side and a numeral on the other, could be purchased from the Lina and then exchanged with a prostitute for a specific service. The process was depersonalized, efficient, and transcational. From the central corridor, a series of doorways led to the individual cells or cubicula. These were the actual rooms where the services were rendered, and they were brutally functional. A typical cubiculum was little more than a closet, barely large enough for its primary piece of furniture. A raised stone or masonry plinth that served as a bed. A thin, likely vermin-infested mattress of straw or wool would be placed on top. There was no other furniture. A small niche in the wall might hold a single oil lamp, its flickering flame casting dancing, distorted shadows on the rough plaster walls. The only decoration, as seen in Pompeii, might be a series of crudely painted erotic frescoes above the doorways. These were not art. They were a visual menu depicting the various specialties offered within. The walls themselves often bore witness to the room's function. They were covered in graffiti, a archive of the establishment's life, scratched into the plaster by both clients and the prostitutes themselves. Names, prices, crude boasts of sexual prowess, and brief, despairing comments formed a layered, anonymous record of the countless encounters that had taken place within these cramped, airless spaces. This was the world that Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, allegedly chose to inhabit. According to the ancient sources, her participation was not that of a client or an observer. She entered the Lupa NAR as a worker. She would occupy one of these empty cells, under the name Lycisca. The historical accounts of Juvenal and Cassius Dio claim that she would stand in the doorway, her body exposed, soliciting customers alongside the other women. She subjected herself to the same commercial logic, the same physical indignities, and the same abject conditions as the lowest slave prostitute. The empress, who could command the wealth of the world, was now serving anonymous men for a few bronze coins. Her transformation was complete. She had not only escaped the palace, she had successfully infiltrated the lower strung of the social order and, for a few hours, become an anonymous and disposable part of it. The act of the empress entering a common brothel to serve as a profoundly counterintuitive that it strains the limits of historical credulity. The ancient sources, writing with a clear moralizing undistortion, insatiable, nymphomaniacal lust. The poet Juvenal, in his famous satire Vi, paints a picture of a woman driven by a burning physical need that the confines of the palace could not contain, describing her as possessing an uncontrollable and promiscuous nature. While this may contain a kernel of truth, it is an insufficient and one-dimensional explanation for a pattern of behavior so complex and laden with extreme risk. To truly approach an understanding, one must move beyond simplistic moral condemnation and explore the deeper psychological frameworks that might underpin such radical self-degradation. A primary motivation, as previously suggested, was likely the pursuit of a profound and absolute form of anonymity. In her public life, every interaction was mediated by her identity. She was the Empress, the wife of Claudius, the mother of Britannicus, with ambition, with calculated flattery. Their desire was never for her as an individual, but for the power she represented. In the anonymous squalor of a a brothel, this entire social construct was inverted. She was not a person but a commodity. The men who paid for her services desired a body, a function, an act. They were ignorant of, and indifferent to, the identity of the woman providing it. For someone trapped in a role of constant, high-stakes performance, this utter depersonalization may have felt like a form of liberation. It was an escape not just from the palace, but from the very self that the palace had constructed. A second, more complex psychological driver may have been a perverse and paradoxical exercise of power and control. On the surface, placing oneself in a position of sexual servitude appears to be a total surrender of power. However, the context is critical. The other women in the Luper were trapped by circumstance, by slavery, debt, or desperation. Messalina was there by choice. Her ability to enter this world of absolute powerlessness and then leave it, to return to the apex of the social order before dawn, was in itself an act of supreme power. She was a tourist in the land of the damned. This voluntary submission, this temporary adoption of the victim role, could serve to reinforce her own agency. She controlled the entire narrative. Unlike the true slaves, she was never truly a victim because she held the ultimate power. The power to leave. This dynamic suggests a deep-seated need to test the boundaries of her own freedom, to prove to herself that her power was so absolute it could even encompass its own temporary negation. Furthermore, one must consider the role of transgression itself as a form of psychological stimulus. The life of an empress, while luxurious, was also monotonous in its formality and predictability. When all material desires can be instantly gratified, the very act of desiring can become blunted. In such a state of existential ennui, the only remaining frontier for novel experience is the realm of the forbidden. Messalina's actions can be interpreted as a systematic escalation of transgressive behavior. The palace affairs were a breach of marital fidelity. The excursions into the sub-Euro were a breach of class and decorum. The act of prostitution was a breach of her very identity as an imperial matron. Each step took her further into territory from which there was no social return. The frisson of potential discovery, of utter ruin hanging by a thread, may have been a potent stimulant, an addictive thrill that the court could never offer. It was a compulsion that found its outlet not merely in the sexual act itself, but in the shattering of every conceivable social and moral taboo associated with it. These potential motivations, the craving for anonymity, the paradoxical exercise of control, and the addiction to transgression, are not mutually exclusive. It is more likely that her behavior stemmed from a complex nexus of these psychological imperatives. The simple label of lust fails to capture the profound psychological schism that must have existed within her. The chasm between the dignified, powerful Empress Valeria Messalina and the anonymous, debased she-wolf, Lycisca. It was a schism that she actively cultivated, and according to one of the most infamous stories from the ancient Chronicles, she would eventually seek to push this exploration of sexual degradation to its absolute physical and competitive limit. This psychological drive, this compulsion to explore the furthest frontiers of transgression, was not merely a generalized impulse. According to one of the most specific and scandalous accounts to have survived from antiquity, it culminated in a singular, legendary event, a formal contest. The narrative of this competition comes to us not from a historian like Tacitus, but from the encyclopedist Pliny the Elder in his sprawling work, Natural History. While cataloguing the supposed endurance of various animal species, Pliny makes a startling digression to offer what he presents as a factual account of human endurance, citing the Empress Messalina as his prime exhibit. The event, as Pliny describes it, was framed as a direct challenge. It was a wager, a formal trial of stamina. Messalina's opponent was not a courtly rival or a political adversary, but the most famous and successful prostitute in Rome. Her name is given as Scylla, a name that itself carries mythological connotations of a ravenous sea monster. Scylla was a professional at the peak of her trade, a woman whose reputation was built on her legendary capacity and resilience in the brutal marketplace of the Lupernaria. The contest was to be a duel between the Empress, the ultimate amateur driven by psychological compulsion, and the city's undisputed professional champion. The terms of the competition were starkly simple. It was a marathon, a test of pure physiological endurance. The contest would begin at dusk and end at dawn. The winner would be the woman who could service the greater number of men within that period. The venue was the familiar territory of a sub-UA brothel, likely within Messalina's designated cell, her personal theater of degradation. The stakes were not monetary. They were about a form of brutal, elemental prestige. It was a contest to determine who was the true master of this dark craft, a competition for a crown that no one in respectable society would ever acknowledge. As the contest began, the brothel would have functioned as it always did, with a steady stream of anonymous clients seeking transactional pleasure. But within this one cell, a grim and silent tally was being kept. Each man who entered and left represented another point in the score. This was not about seduction or intimacy. It was about volume, about efficiency, about reducing the human encounter to a mere statistic. The act became a unit of work, repeated relentlessly, hour after hour. Through the long Roman night, one can only speculate on the physical and psychological toll. The body would be pushed to its absolute limits, while the mind would have to retreat, to dissociate completely from the mechanical reality of the flesh. Pliny the Elder provides a specific outcome. He records that after a full night of continuous activity, the professional, Scylla, finally conceded defeat. She was exhausted, physically broken by the pace. Messalina, however, was not. Even after her opponent had retired, the Empress allegedly continued. Pliny states that she did not cease until she had reached her 20-5th client. The poet Juvenal, likely alluding to the same event or general pattern of behavior, provides a complementary image in his sixth satire. He describes the Empress being the very last prostitute to leave the brothel, as the Leno was shutting the doors for the morning, weary, but not yet satisfied, her body grimy from the night's work, carrying the stench of the brothel back with her to the imperial bed. The significance of this event, if it indeed happened, transcends any simple notion of lust. An appetite for pleasure is, by its nature, finite. This was not a pursuit of pleasure, it was a demonstration of will. It was an athletic contest, a grim and perverse echo of the gladiatorial games, where the combatant was her own body and the opponents were an endless, anonymous stream of men. By winning, she was not proving her desirability. She was proving her indestructibility. She demonstrated that her will could dominate her own physical being to an extent that even a hardened professional could not match. The men involved were not partners, they were merely the instruments of her victory, the weight she lifted in her personal contest of endurance. In this sordid arena, she had achieved a form of supremacy as absolute as the political power she wielded from the palace. She had conquered the underworld on its own terms. The narrative of a contest of this nature, so extreme in its particulars, forces a necessary and critical pause. It is the point at which the chronicle of events must be subordinated to an analysis of the evidence itself. The stories of Messalina, the alias, the brothel, the marathon of endurance are not self-evident truths. They are literary constructs, transmitted to us through a small and highly biased group of ancient authors. To continue without examining the provenance and agenda of these sources would be to mistake accusation for fact, and moralistic propaganda for objective history. The three principal historical sources for Messalina's life are Publius Cornelius Tacitus, Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, and Cassius Dio. None of them were her contemporaries. Tacitus, the most detailed and respected of the three, was born around 56 AD, more than a decade after Messalina's death. His account in the Annals was written during the reign of Trajan in the early 2nd century, over 60 years after the events he describes. Suetonius, an equestrian who served as an imperial secretary, wrote his famous biography of Claudius in the 12 Caesars around the same time. Cassius Dio, a Greek senator writing in the early 3rd century, was the most chronologically distant, composing his Roman history nearly 180 years after Messalina was executed. This significant time lag is the first and most crucial filter to apply. These authors were not eyewitnesses. They were relying on earlier, now minus lost histories, on official records from the Senate, the Acta Senatus, which would have reflected the official, post-purge narrative, and, undoubtedly, on the vast reservoir of court gossip and scandalous anecdotes that had festered and grown over the intervening decades. The story of Messalina had to generations to metastasize from a political scandal into a dark legend before our primary historians ever set it down. The second filter is the profound institutional bias of the authors themselves. Tacitus and Cassius Dio were senators. Their view of history was shaped by a deep seated nostalgia for the old republic and a corresponding antipathy toward the principate. They viewed the imperial system as a source of corruption and moral decay, and they particularly resented the influence of those they considered illegitimate power holders, women and imperial freedmen. Messalina was the archetype of both, for Tacitus was not merely the biography of a corrupt woman. It was a case study in the sickness of the entire imperial court and a damning indictment of an emperor, Claudius, who was too weak or too foolish to control his own household. Every depraved act she is alleged to have committed serves to highlight the degradation of the state under one-man rule. The third and perhaps most powerful filter is the pervasive misogyny of Roman elite culture. A woman who wielded political power was seen as an aberration, a violation of the natural order, Rome. The traditional sphere for a high-born woman was the home, managing the household, raising children, and projecting an image of quiet dignity. Messalina did not merely step outside this sphere. She operated in the male-dominated world of high politics with ruthless efficiency. The standard method for discrediting such a woman in Roman rhetoric was to attack her sexual morality. Accusations of insatiable lust were a political weapon, a way to portray her ambition not as a rational pursuit of power, but as a symptom of a pathological, uncontrollable, and inherently feminine vice. This pattern of posthumous character assassination was not unique to her. It was applied to nearly every powerful woman of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, from Livia to Agrippina the Younger. Finally, we must distinguish the historians from other sources like Pliny the Elder and the satirist Juvenal. Pliny, who provided the account of the contest with Sylla, was an encyclopedist, a collector of facts and curiosities. His standards for verification were not those of a modern historian. He often included sensational anecdotes and hearsay alongside scientific observations. Juvenal was a poet, writing satire. His goal was not to record history but to critique the moral failings of his society through grotesque exaggeration. His portrait of Messalina is a literary caricature, a symbol of ultimate female depravity, designed to shock and appall his audience. Therefore, while the core political events of Messalina's career, the elimination of rivals, the accumulation of wealth, and her final, fatal affair with Gaius Silius, are likely grounded in historical reality, the most lurid details of her nocturnal life must be viewed with extreme skepticism. They may be exaggerations of her own courtly infidelities, or they may be outright fabrications, created and amplified over decades to serve a clear political and moralistic purpose. The she-wolf of the sub-URA may be less a historical person and more a ghost, a cautionary tale constructed by a hostile senatorial tradition to haunt the memory of the Claudian regime. Regardless of the historical veracity of her alleged life as a common prostitute, the incalculable risk associated with such behavior warrants a purely logistical analysis. The lurid tales of the sub-URA, whether true or false, tend to overshadow the far more concrete and immediate dangers Messalina faced with every transgression, both within and outside the palace. The political calculus of her position was unforgiving. Any verifiable act of adultery, let alone a public scandal of epic proportion, was not merely a personal failing. It was high treason, and the consequences were absolute. The legal framework was unambiguous. The Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coerciens, a law instituted by the Emperor Augustus, had transformed adultery from a private family matter into a public crime. For ordinary citizens, the penalties were severe, including financial penalties and exile. For a member of the imperial family, the empress's body was not her own. It was a vessel of the state, the guarantor of the purity of the imperial bloodline. Any illicit sexual act polluted cast doubt upon the legitimacy of her children, most critically the heir Britannicus. An empress's infidelity was therefore tantamount to an attack on the stability of the entire Roman state. The most immediate danger was discovery and subsequent blackmail. Every secret excursion from the palace, every clandestine affair, created a new set of witnesses. A guard who saw her leaving, a slave who prepared her disguise, a lover who shared her bed. Each of these individuals became a repository of knowledge that could destroy her. In the cutthroat environment of the Claudian court, such information was a weapon of immense value. A rival, like her niece Agrippina the Younger, or a powerful freedman who felt his position was threatened, could use this knowledge to orchestrate her downfall. A single, credible witness brought before the emperor would have been enough to seal her fate. The risks she faced in the sub-URI itself were of a different, more primal nature. Disguised as a common woman and operating alone, she was stripped of the immunity her station provided. The district was rife with violent crime. She was a potential target for robbery, assault, or murder, with no recourse to the protection of her guards. Discovery of her identity in such a context could have been even more dangerous than exposure at court. A client in a brothel, a leno, or another prostitute who recognized her would suddenly possess the single most explosive secret in the empire. The temptation to use that information for blackmail would be immense. Equally, the fear of what the empress might do to them if her secret were kept could lead to a preemptive, violent act of silencing. In the lawless depths of the sub-URA, her identity was both a potential fortune and a death warrant. Beyond the immediate physical and political dangers, there was the more insidious risk of a slow, creeping erosion of her authority through rumor. The palace was a whispering gallery. Even if no single individual dared to make a formal accusation, the accumulation of gossip and innuendo could fatally undermine her position. In a court built on perception and prestige, the reputation of the empress was a critical component of the regime's stability. If she became widely perceived as a woman of uncontrollable and debased appetites, her political judgment, her alliances, and her role as the guardian of the dynasty would all be called into question. The aura of imperial dignity, once shattered, could not be easily restored. Messalina's continued survival, despite this constant, multi-faceted threat, suggests either that the most extreme stories were indeed fabrications, or that she operated with a combination of extraordinary luck and ruthless efficiency in managing her secrets. Any potential witness to her indiscretions would have been acutely aware of the fate of those who had crossed her in the political arena. The fear of reprisal was a powerful incentive for silence. This reliance on fear and secrecy was an inherently unstable foundation for power. It was a high-wire act performed without a net. Each successful transgression emboldened her, pushing her to take greater risks, while simultaneously increasing the number of people who held a piece of her ruin in their hands. The entire structure of her secret life was a pyramid of risk, built on a foundation of complicit silence, which could be brought crashing down by a single, dislodged stone. The continued success of her deceptions, both within the palace and allegedly beyond it, did not inspire caution. Instead, it appears to have bred a profound sense of invulnerability. The high-wire act, performed successfully night after night, ceased to feel like a risk and began to feel like the natural order of things. This psychological shift was accompanied by a critical change in her behavior. Almost ritualistic separation between her public persona as empress and her secret life as a transgressor began to dissolve. The audacity that had once been confined to the shadows of the sub-URA now bled into the daylight of the imperial court. Her infidelities, previously conducted with a degree of discretion or coercion, evolved into a more open and systematic enterprise. They were no longer simply acts of personal gratification. They became an integral part of her political and financial operations. Messalina, according to Tacitus, began to use her position as a transcational tool, bestowing favor and advancement upon a series of lovers drawn from the senatorial and equestrian orders. The imperial bedchamber became an antechamber to power, an informal venue where careers were made and fortunes were secured. This was not a subtle process. Men who gained the empress's favor found themselves inexplicably promoted to high office, granted lucrative governorships, or given command of legions. Wealthy individuals who became her partners were awarded profitable state contracts or shielded from prosecution for financial malfeasance. The system of imperial patronage, which was supposed to be administered by the emperor based on merit and loyalty to the state, was effectively hijacked. Messalina created a parallel structure of influence, a shadow government whose primary qualification for entry was a combination of personal attractiveness and a willingness to participate in her illicit activities. This network of lovers served multiple purposes. It surrounded her with a cadre of men whose personal success was inextricably linked to her own. They were her allies, bound to her not by political ideology, but by a shared conspiracy of corruption and adultery. Their loyalty was, in theory, guaranteed by the principle of mutually assured destruction. To expose her would be to expose themselves and forfeit all they had gained. This network also generated immense personal wealth. Tacitus alleges that she and her circle engaged in the open sale of public offices and even Roman citizenship, a highly prized commodity. Estates of wealthy individuals without clear heirs were sometimes targeted, with wills being forged to name the empress or her associates as beneficiaries. The sheer brazenness of this operation is difficult to overstate. It transformed the court into a marketplace of vice. The whispers of her indiscretions were no longer confined to the slave quarters. They became an open secret among the Roman elite. Senators would have watched with a mixture of fear and contempt as less qualified but more handsome rivals were elevated above them. The traditional aristocracy, already resentful of the influence of the imperial freedmen, now had to contend with a new, and in their eyes far more scandalous, path to power. This escalating audacity can likely be attributed to critical miscalculations on Messalina's part. First, she seems to have developed an utter contempt for her husband's powers of observation. Claudius was portrayed by his enemies, and thus by the historical record, as an oblivious, scholarly fool, easily manipulated and disconnected from the realities of his own court. Messalina appears to have subscribed to this view, believing that as long as she maintained the outward facade of a dutiful wife in his presence, he would remain ignorant of her activities. Second, she overestimated the security of her own position. As the mother of the heir, Britannicus, she may have believed herself to be indispensable and therefore untouchable. She was not just the emperor's wife. She was the linchpin of the dynasty. To remove her would be to destabilize the entire regime, a risk she likely believed no one would be willing to take. But this web of transcational affairs, while politically useful, was built on a foundation of cynicism and self-minus interest. It lacked any genuine emotional or ideological anchor. Within this series of calculated alliances, however, a new relationship was forming. It was a connection that would differ from all the others in its intensity and its public nature. This was her affair with a man who was her equal in ambition and, in the end, her partner, fatal act of defiance. The relationship that would ultimately seal her fate, however, was of a different order and tied as uncoercive liaisons that had preceded it. It was a public and all-consuming obsession, focused on a man who was, in the estimation of the historian Tacitus, the most handsome of the Roman nobility. His name was Gaius Silius. He was not a peripheral figure or a mere courtly adornment. Silius was a man at the apex of a successful political career. He was a senator of distinguished family and had been designated for the consulship of the following year, the highest office in the Roman state. He was also married to a respected noblewoman, Eunice Ilene. In every respect, he was a pillar of the Roman establishment. The affair between Messalina and Silius was not a secret whispered in the palace corridors. It was a spectacle, conducted with a flagrant disregard for public opinion or the possibility of imperial discovery. According to Tacitus, the empress's infatuation was total. She made no attempt at concealment. She would visit Silius's home openly, often accompanied by a large entourage, as if paying a formal visit. He was showered wealth and political honors. The traditional barriers between the imperial house and the private nobility were systematically dismantled for his benefit. The assets of the imperial household began a systematic migration to Silius's private mansion. Slaves who had once served the emperor were now part of his domestic staff. Priceless furniture, heirlooms of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and works of art were transferred from the Palatine to adorn his residence. It was as if Messalina were establishing a rival court, a new center of power with Silius at its heart. For his part, Silius was not a passive recipient of this dangerous affection. The historical record portrays him as a man fully aware of the mortal peril in which he was placing himself. He understood that the affair was a capital offense, yet he was also aware of the immense prize. Tacitus presents a psychological turning point in the relationship. Silius, recognizing that the affair had become too public to conceal and too dangerous to abandon, allegedly forced the issue. He argued that they had passed the point of no return. A clandestine affair might eventually be discovered and punished, but a bold, preemptive strike offered a chance, however slim, of ultimate victory. He was no longer content to be the empress's lover. He saw an opportunity to become the emperor's successor. The proposition he made was one of ultimate treason. He demanded that Messalina divorce Claudius and marry him. Together, they would adopt her son, Britannicus, and rule the empire. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity, a direct challenge to the throne. The motivations of the two conspirators were utterly different. Silius was driven by a cold, rational ambition. He saw a path to absolute power, and he was willing to risk everything to take it. He was childless, and the prospect of becoming emperor and stepfather to the designated heir was the ultimate political prize. His demand for a formal marriage was a necessary step to legitimize the crew he envisioned. Messalina's motivations, as Tacitus portrays them, were more complex and psychologically driven. She was not seeking the title of empress, which she already possessed. She was not necessarily driven by a rational desire to replace her husband with a more vigorous partner. Instead, Tacitus suggests she was captivated by the sheer scale of the transgression itself. The idea of a public wedding to her lover while her husband was still alive appealed to her for the sheer magnitude of the infamy, which she saw as the ultimate gratification for a soul jaded by satiety. The plan was no longer merely a breach of morality. It was a theatrical act of rebellion, a final, spectacular defiance of all Roman law and tradition. She agreed to the plan. Silius, now a full partner in the conspiracy, divorced his own wife Julia Silene. The stage was being set for the final act. They were no longer merely lovers engaged in a dangerous affair. They were conspirators plotting to overthrow the government. All they needed was the opportune moment to legitimize their union and present the Roman state with an accomplished fact. That moment would come when the emperor himself was absent from the city. The central and most perplexing question arising from this period is how the Emperor Claudius, the absolute ruler of the Roman world, could remain oblivious to a conspiracy that was, by all accounts, an open secret among the city's elite. Messalina and Silius were not conducting their affair in the shadows. They were flaunting it. The transfer of imperial property, the public visits, the elevation of Silius to a status rivaling that of the emperor's heir, these were not subtle acts. The explanation for the emperor's apparent ignorance is not a simple one. It was not a matter of mere personal gullibility but a systemic failure, a carefully constructed and maintained bubble of isolation around the person of the emperor. A significant contributing factor was the nature of Claudius himself as perceived by his contemporaries. He was a man of scholarly habits and administrative diligence. His days were consumed by the duties of the state, hearing legal cases, responding to petitions from across the empire, and overseeing his ambitious public works projects. He was, in essence, the chief magistrate and bureaucrat of Rome. This focus on the machinery of government may have left him with little time or inclination for the informal social intelligence and court gossip that would have alerted a more socially engaged ruler. His personal history, decades of being sidelined, mocked, and treated as an invalid, had not equipped him with the instincts of a court politician. He was not a natural reader of social cues or a connoisseur of intrigue. This personal disposition was compounded by the deliberate actions of his inner circle. The imperial freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, were the gatekeepers of his world. They managed his schedule, filtered his correspondence, and controlled who was granted an audience. For a time, it was in their strategic interest to allow Messalina's excesses to continue. Her purges of the Senate, such as the destruction of Valerius Asiaticus, often aligned with their own goal of weakening the old aristocracy. Her infidelities were an unknown vulnerability, a weapon they could hold and reserve to be deployed if she ever turned against them. They may have calculated that a weakened, compromised empress was more useful to them than a virtuous one. Therefore, they had every reason to insulate Claudius from the rumors, to dismiss any whispers that reached them as slander, and to ensure that no credible accuser could gain access to the emperor. The most powerful deterrent against any potential informant, however, was fear. Messalina had spent years cultivating an aura of ruthless terror. The court had witnessed her orchestrate the exile and death of Claudius's own nieces and the summary execution of senators like Appius Silenus on the flimsiest of pretexts. Any individual considering bringing the truth to Claudius faced a terrifying calculation. They would be making a direct accusation against the most powerful and vindictive woman in the empire. If the emperor chose not to believe them, or if Messalina succeeded in persuading him of their malicious intent, their life would be forfeit. The risk of being the messenger was simply too great. It was far safer for senators, equestrians, and even the common people to see what was happening and say nothing. An entire society became complicit in a conspiracy of silence, each individual acting in their own rational self-mindedness, interest to avoid the empress's lethal wrath. Finally, one must not discount Messalina's own role in actively managing her husband's perception. In his presence, she would have continued to play the role of the dutiful wife and mother. She understood Claudius's temperament, his anxieties, and his affections. She could manipulate his emotions, assuage his suspicions, and present a convincing facade of domestic loyalty that would create a powerful cognitive dissonance with any rumors he might accidentally overhear. The man she presented herself as to him was utterly incompatible with the figure of debauchery and treason being whispered about in the city. For Claudius, it may have been easier to believe that the entire world was slandering his wife than to accept the monstrous truth of her double life. Thus, the emperor's ignorance was not a void, but a constructed reality. It was a product of his own detached personality, the calculated insulation provided by his freedmen, the paralyzing fear she instilled in her potential enemies, and her own skillful manipulation. He lived at the center of a web of deceit, shielded from a truth that all one else in Rome could see. This delicate equilibrium, however, could only be maintained as long as Messalina's transgressions remained, however notionally, within the bounds of a private affair. The moment her actions became a public, official, and undeniable challenge to the emperor's own authority, the calculus for everyone involved would change in an instant. That moment was fast approaching. In the autumn of 48 AD, Claudius traveled to Ostia, the port city of Rome, to preside over a ceremony and inspect the progress of the new harbor he was constructing. This temporary absence from the capital provided the opportunity that Messalina and Silius had been waiting for. They decided to move beyond their clandestine affair and enact a central piece of their treasonous plan, a public and formal marriage. The sheer insanity of this act is what elevates the story from a tale of courtly intrigue to one of legendary recklessness. An empress, while her husband the emperor was still alive and ruling, was about to commit bigamy, an act that was not merely illegal but a direct and unambiguous usurpation of imperial authority. The ceremony, as described by Tacitus, was not a secret, shamefaced ritual. It was a full public wedding conducted with all the traditional rites and celebrations. Messalina and Silius gathered a group of witnesses as required by Roman law. They signed a formal marriage contract, the tabula nuptialis, a document that would have explicitly declared Messalina to be the wife of Gaius Silius. A dowry was arranged and formally transferred. Sacrifices were made to the gods to bless the union. The ceremony was followed by a lavish wedding feast, a banquet to which a significant number of the Roman elite were invited. The guests who attended this event were placed in an impossible position. To accept the invitation was to become a participant in an act of high treason. To refuse it was to incur the immediate and certain wrath of the Empress and her new consort, who at that moment held de facto control of the city. Most chose the path of least immediate resistance and attended the celebration, becoming unwilling witnesses to the unfolding coup. The atmosphere at the feast must have been a surreal mixture of forced gaiety and palpable terror. Tacitus paints a vivid picture of the wedding banquet. He describes Messalina, in her role as the new bride, reclining on a dining couch next to Silius. There was wine, music, and celebration, but it was all shadowed by the impending sense of doom. At the height of the festivities, in an act that symbolized the complete overthrow of social norms, Messalina reportedly had the guests climb trees in the garden to witness a symbolic grape harvest. As part of this bacchanalian revelry, she herself, with her hair unbound, danced with the abandon of a Maenad, celebrating her liberation from her old life. This was not merely a marriage. It was a carefully staged piece of political theater. The intention was to create an undeniable fact on the ground. When Claudius returned from Ostia, he was not to be confronted with a rumor of an affair, but with the legally and religiously consecrated reality of a new imperial couple. They were presenting themselves as the new rulers of Rome. The adoption of Britannicus, which Silius had planned, securing the succession and providing a veneer of dynastic continuity. They were betting everything on a single audacious gambit. That the Senate, the people, and crucially, the Praetorian Guard, when faced with a new vigorous and handsome ruling pair, would abandon the aging and seemingly ineffectual Claudius. The act was a profound miscalculation of the foundations of Roman power. They mistook the silent complicity of the court for genuine support. They failed to understand that the loyalty of the key institutions was not to the person of the emperor or his wife, but to the stability of the imperial system itself. The freedmen, the Praetorian commanders, and the senior senators who had tolerated Messalina's personal vices would not stand for a chaotic and illegitimate transfer of power that threatened to plunge the empire into civil war. Her private transgressions were one thing, a public challenge to the very legitimacy of the principate was another. The news of the wedding traveled quickly from the city to the port of Ostia. For the powerful freedmen in Claudius's entourage, the moment of decision had arrived. Messalina's actions were no longer a containable scandal or a source of leverage. She and Silius had launched a direct attack on their master, and by extension on them. Their own survival now depended on destroying her before she could destroy them. The carefully constructed bubble of ignorance around the emperor was about to be burst with brutal and decisive force. The news of the public wedding in Rome did not arrive in Ostia as a vague rumor. It came as a series of specific, verifiable reports delivered by panicked couriers to the imperial entourage. For the three principal freedmen, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, this information precipitated an immediate and existential crisis. The paradigm that had governed their actions for 7 years was irrevocably shattered. Messalina was no longer a useful, if dangerous, internal player in the court's power dynamics. She had aligned herself with the powerful member of the senatorial class and made a direct, public bid for the throne itself. Their previous strategy of isolating the emperor from the truth was now a catastrophic liability. They had been the architects of the information bubble, and its bursting threatened to implicate them in the empress's treason. Gaius Silius, as a new princeps, would have no use for his predecessor's favored freedmen. He would inevitably replace them with his own clients and allies. For Narcissus and his colleagues, the marriage of Messalina and Silius was not just a political realignment. It was a death sentence. Their survival was now contingent on a single objective, the complete and immediate destruction of the empress and her new consort. According to the account of Tacitus, a frantic council of war was held among the most powerful members of Claudius's inner circle in Ostia. The initial reaction was not one of decisive action, but of panic and indecision. Even in this moment of ultimate crisis, the fear that Messalina had cultivated held its power. Callistus, the secretary for petitions, argued for caution. He recalled the empress's past triumphs, her ability to turn the tables on her accusers and destroy them. He suggested that she might yet talk her way out of this, repent for her actions, and persuade Claudius to forgive her, in which case their intervention would be fatal. Pallas, the treasury secretary, was similarly paralyzed by fear and effectively abstained from the debate. It was Narcissus, the emperor's chief secretary, who recognized the suicidal folly of inaction. He countered the arguments of his colleagues with cold, brutal logic. Their only path to survival, he contended, was to ensure that Messalina was given no opportunity to the emperor. If she were allowed an audience, her influence over Claudius was such that she might well succeed in turning him against them. The conspiracy had to be framed not as a matter of adultery, but as a direct and imminent plot to seize the throne and assassinate the emperor. The charge had to be absolute, the evidence overwhelming, and the verdict delivered before the accused had a chance to mount a defense. Having solidified his own resolve, Narcissus formulated a plan of attack. The primary obstacle remained Claudius himself. Breaking 3 years of carefully constructed denial and defection required a precise and powerful psychological shock. A formal report from Narcissus alone might be dismissed as a political maneuver. The first blow had to be delivered by a source that was personal, emotional, and seemingly minus political. For this task, he selected 2 of Claudius's favorite concubines, women who shared the emperor's bed and had his trust. Their names were Calpurnia and Cleopatra. The 2 women were briefed by Narcissus. Their role was to bypass the official court protocol and gain immediate access to Claudius. They were instructed on the precise information to deliver and the emotional tenor of their performance. The plan was executed perfectly. The concubines burst into the emperor's presence, prostrated themselves at his feet, and began a carefully rehearsed display of terror and despair. Calpurnia, taking the lead, declared that she was there to reveal a fact of monumental importance. Messalina was married to Gaius Silius. This initial revelation, delivered in a state of high emotional drama, was designed to crack the emperor's defenses. When Claudius, in a state of confusion, demanded corroboration, the second concubine, Cleopatra, stepped forward to confirm that Calpurnia's story was true. They informed him that all of Rome, the Senate, the army, the people, had been witness to the public ceremony. With the emperor's reality now destabilized, the stage was set for Narcissus to make his entrance. He entered the chamber not as a subordinate offering advice, but as a commander taking control of a crisis. He confirmed the story of the concubines and immediately escalated the stakes. He framed the marriage not as an act of passion, but as a calculated coup d'etat. He produced a list of witnesses and participants, emphasizing the involvement of the city's elite. He warned Claudius that Silius was already acting as emperor in Rome. The purpose of this information barrage was to induce a state of paralyzing fear in Claudius, to make him feel that his throne and his very life were hanging by a thread, and that his only hope lay in surrendering all control of the situation to Narcissus. The long-maintained bubble had not just been pierced, it had been violently obliterated. The psychological assault orchestrated by Narcissus had its intended effect. Claudius, confronted with a story that was not only shocking but corroborated by his most trusted personal attendants and his chief secretary, was thrown into a state of acute panic. His reaction was not that of a decisive emperor, but of a terrified man who believed his life was in imminent danger. According to Tacitus, his first, repeated question was not about the state of the empire or the loyalty of the legions, but a simple legion's personal query. Am I still emperor? Is Silius a private citizen? He had lost his grip on reality, unable to distinguish between the established order and the coup that Narcissus was so vividly describing. Narcissus seized on this moment of mental collapse. He did not wait for formal orders. He began issuing commands in the emperor's name, acting with the full authority of the imperial office. His primary objective was to get Claudius back to Rome as quickly as possible. He understood that the emperor's physical presence in the capital was essential to reasserting control. He was also racing against time. He needed to reach the city and neutralize the conspirators before Messalina and Silius could rally their supporters, or, more critically, before Messalina could gain an audience with her husband and deploy her formidable powers of persuasion. A small, heavily armed escort was assembled. Claudius was bundled into a litter and the procession set off on the 16-mile journey from Ostia to Rome. The atmosphere of the journey was one of pure terror, amplified by Narcissus at every opportunity. The freedman positioned himself within the emperor's litter, providing a constant, running commentary on the crisis. He painted a picture of a city entirely under the control of the rebels, of legions on the brink of defecting, of a conspiracy that had penetrated the very heart of the imperial household. The most senior members of Claudius's retinue who rode with them, men like the Praetorian prefect Geta, were also under suspicion. Narcissus did not know the full extent of the conspiracy and trusted no one. He needed to secure the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, the ultimate arbiters of power in any Roman succession crisis. To do this, he took an extraordinary and constitutionally unprecedented step. For the duration of the crisis, he demanded and was granted temporary supreme command of the Praetorian Guard. A mere freedman, a former slave, was now in command of the emperor's elite military bodyguard. This act demonstrates the totality of Claudius's abdication of authority. He had effectively made Narcissus the acting dictator of Rome. As the procession neared the city, the psychological pressure on Claudius reached its peak. He was reportedly in a state of near-total incoherence, swinging wildly between pathetic expressions of fear and impotent bursts of anger. He lamented his fate, cursed the disloyalty of his wives, and seemed incapable of making any rational decision. Narcissus, meanwhile, was a model of cold efficiency, dispatching messengers ahead to the Praetorian barracks, ordering them to secure the city gates and prepare for a wave of arrest. Upon their arrival in Rome, Claudius was not taken to the palace on the Palatine Hill. That was enemy territory, the seat of Messalina's power. Instead, he was escorted directly to the Praetorian camp, the fortified military headquarters where he had first been proclaimed emperor 7 years earlier. This was a symbolic and practical masterstroke by Narcissus. It placed the terrified emperor under the direct protection of the only military force that mattered, and it sent an unambiguous signal to the rest of the city about where the true power now resided. Inside the camp, Narcissus brought Claudius before an assembly of the troops. The emperor, still reeling, was likely a pathetic figure, but his presence was all that was required. Narcissus spoke on his behalf. He laid out the full story of the conspiracy, the treasonous marriage, and the plot to overthrow the legitimate ruler. He promised the soldiers a substantial donative, a cash bonus for their continued loyalty, who owed their privileged position to Claudius and had no particular loyalty to Silius or the senatorial class he represented, roared their approval. With the Praetorian Guard now fully mobilized and under his direct command, Narcissus had all the authority he needed. He was ready to unleash the purge. The net that had been so carefully prepared was about to be drawn tight around Messalina, Silius, and everyone who had attended their fatal wedding. With the full military and political authority of the state now consolidated in his hands, Narcissus acted with breathtaking speed and efficiency. The apparatus of the purge, lubricated by the Praetorian Guard's promise of a bonus, was immediately set in motion. Squads of soldiers, acting on lists prepared by the freedmen, fanned out across the city. Their primary targets were Gaius Silius and the principal guests, who had attended the treasonous wedding feast. Just hours before, the symbol of a new regime was about to become a death roster. The conspirators were caught completely off guard. Their plan had been predicated on controlling the narrative upon Claudius's return. They had not anticipated a preemptive military strike, directed with such precision from Ostia. There was no time to organize a defense, to rally their supporters, or to barricade themselves in their homes. The arrests were swift and methodical. Silius was located in the Forum, the public heart of the city, attempting to conduct business as if nothing were amiss, a fatal miscalculation that underestimated the speed with which his enemies could move. He offered no resistance and was taken into custody immediately. Simultaneously, the Praetorians descended upon the homes of the other known conspirators. Tacitus lists several prominent names who were rounded up in this initial wave: Titius Pr. Oculus, Vettius Valens, Pompeius Urbiicus, and Sophia Strogus. These were men from the equestrian and senatorial orders who had either been active participants in the plot or had made the fatal error of attending the wedding. The actor Nestor, who had been coerced into a relationship with the Empress years earlier, was also arrested, his past association now marking him for death. The prisoners were not taken to a civil court or to the Senate House for a formal trial. Such legal niceties would have taken time and offered the accused a platform for their defense. Instead, they were brought directly to the Praetorian camp, where a makeshift tribunal had been established. This was not a court of law. It was a military court-martial, designed for expediency and the certainty of conviction. Claudius presided, though the historical accounts suggest he was little more than a dazed and terrified spectator. The true prosecutor and judge was Narcissus. The proceedings were a formality. The evidence of their presence at the wedding was irrefutable. The charge was high treason. Claudius, prompted by Narcissus, barely spoke, mumbling questions, unseemingly struggling to comprehend the rapid succession of events. The accused had little opportunity to speak in their own defense. Nestor, the actor, reportedly pleaded for his life, tearing off his clothes from floggings he had endured for initially resisting the emperor. He reminded Claudius that he had only complied with Messalina's desires on the emperor's own direct order. For a moment, Claudius seemed to waver, his notorious sentimentality moved by the actor's plight. But the freedman quickly reminded him that with the primary conspirators dead, a minor case like Nestor's was irrelevant, and that no mercy should be shown. The last to be brought before this tribunal was Gaius Silius. He made no attempt to defend himself, nor did he plead for his life. He understood that the game was lost and that any display of weakness would be futile. Tacitus records that his only request was for a quick death. He stood with stoic dignity as the verdict was pronounced. He was then led out, unexecuted on the spot, within the confines of the Praetorian camp. His death was the decapitation of the conspiracy. The purge continued with relentless momentum. The execution of the primary figures was followed by that of the lesser ones. All who were identified as being part of Messalina Ancilius's inner circle were hunted down and killed. Narcissus was not merely punishing treason. He was sanitizing the record. Every individual who had been a beneficiary of Messalina's illicit patronage or a witness to her excesses was a potential liability, a reminder of a period of corruption that had freed men's watch. The most thorough way to ensure their silence was to eliminate them entirely. Within a matter of hours, the formidable power base that Messalina had spent 7 years constructing had been utterly and violently liquidated. Her network of lovers, clients, and political allies ceased to exist. With her entire support structure annihilated, only the Empress herself remained. While the purge was being carried out with military precision across Rome, Messalina was in the gardens of Lucullus, the very estate she had acquired through the destruction of Valerius Asiaticus. The bacchanalian revelry of her wedding feast had dissolved, replaced by an atmosphere of growing apprehension. The first news to reach her would have been fragmented and chaotic. Reports of unusual troop movements, of Praetorians on the streets, of prominent citizens being arrested. Catastrophic news arrived. Gaius Silius was dead. In this moment, the illusion of her invulnerability, an edifice built over 7 years of unchecked power, shattered completely. Her reaction was not one of stoic resolve, but of primal fear. Her first and only instinct was to seek out the source of her power and, she still believed, her ultimate protection. Her husband, Claudius. She was convinced that if she could only speak to him, face to face, she could deploy the familiar arts of persuasion, seduction, and manipulation, but had always served her. She would weep, she would remind him of their shared children, she would cast the blame on others. It was the only strategy she had ever needed, and she saw no other recourse. But the mechanisms of her power had already been dismantled. The imperial litter, the entourage of sycophants, all had vanished. Her slaves, sensing the catastrophic shift in the political winds, began to desert her. No one was willing to be associated with the now toxic empress. Her isolation was as sudden as it was absolute. Tacitus records a scene of profound humiliation. To traverse the city, the Empress of Rome, a woman accustomed to the most opulent modes of transport, was forced to commandeer a small, 3-wheeled cart from the garden, a humble vehicle used for hauling away refuse. Accompanied by only 3 loyal attendants, who had not yet abandoned her, She began her desperate journey through the city toward the Praetorian camp. It was a public spectacle of her downfall. The crowds that had once trembled before her now looked on with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Her passage attracted no deference. Her cries for sympathy were met with silence. The aura of power that had been her shield was gone, and in its place was only the raw vulnerability of a disgraced woman. When she finally reached the heavily fortified walls of the camp, her last hope was extinguished. Narcissus had anticipated her every move. The sentries were under strict orders. The gates remained shut. She was denied entry. She pleaded. She screamed. She invoked her status as Empress and the mother of Britannicus. Her pleas were met with a wall of disciplined silence. The Praetorians, the very men whose loyalty her husband had once commended to her son, now stood as the impassive jailers of her fate. The direct line of influence to Claudius, the central pillar of her entire life, had been irrevocably severed. Defeated and without any other sanctuary, she returned to the gardens of Lucullus. The opulent estate was no longer a symbol of her triumph, but her prison. There in the sprawling, manicured grounds, her composure finally shattered. The ruthless political operator gave way to a terrified young woman, alternating between fits of rage, pathetic self-pity, and the faint, flickering hope that the emperor's mood might soften. It was into this scene of final despair that a new figure arrived. Her mother, Dumitia Lip Ida. The relationship between mother and daughter had reportedly been strained during Messalina's years of absolute power. But now, with her daughter's ruin complete, Lip Ida returned. Her purpose was not to offer emotional comfort, but to provide a final, pragmatic piece of Roman aristocratic counsel. She saw the situation with cold clarity. There would be no trial, no exile, no possibility of a reprieve. A death sentence was inevitable. Lip Ida urged her daughter to preempt the executioner's sword. A voluntary death by her own hand was the only way to salvage a final shred of dignity from the wreckage of her life. It was the traditional, stoic path for a Roman noble facing certain disgrace. She advised Messalina to end her own life and thus control the final act of her own story. But Messalina, for all her cruelty and audacity, lacked the requisite fortitude. Her spirit, as Tacitus notes, was corrupted by a life of luxury. She could not bring herself to take this final step. She wept and lamented her fate, clinging to life even as the certainty of death closed in around her. The decision, like all others now, had been taken out of her hands. She could only wait. While Messalina languished in the final hours of her life, the political situation back at the center of power was dangerously fluid. The immediate crisis of the coup had been averted, the primary conspirators executed. Claudius, having presided over the bloody tribunal in the Praetorian camp, was escorted back to the imperial palace. The adrenaline of fear and the narcotic of decisive, violent action began to wear off. He was returned to his familiar routine, and then he sat down for his evening meal. As the emperor consumed his dinner and drank his customary large quantities of wine, a subtle but critical psychological shift began to occur. The terror that Narcissus had sought to recede, replaced by the familiar weight of his long-standing and complex relationship with his wife. He began to soften. His anger, having been spent on the executed conspirators, gave way to a dawning sense of regret and perhaps even a flicker of his old affection. Tacitus reports that Claudius, warmed by the food and wine, made a fateful command. He ordered that the poor woman, a term of pity, miseram, in the original Latin, should be told to come and plead her case before him the next day. For Narcissus, this was the single most terrifying development imaginable. He had been present, observing the emperor's changing mood. He understood the profound malleability of Claudius's character better than anyone. He knew that an overnight delay was not a strategic pause but a fatal error. If Messalina were granted an audience in the morning, the entire situation could be reversed. She would weep. She would present their children, Britannicus and Octavia, as living symbols of their union, and she would almost certainly succeed in turning the suggestible emperor against the very men who had just saved him. Narcissus, the savior, would be recast as a treacherous Vangole who had manipulated the emperor into killing his innocent wife. His own execution would surely follow. He could not wait for a formal, written death warrant. The emperor's verbal command to allow Messalina a hearing had superseded any implicit consent for her execution. Narcissus was now acting in direct defiance of his master's stated will. In a moment of supreme, unilateral decision-making, he strode out of the dining hall. He did not consult his fellow freedmen, who were likely still paralyzed by the day's events. He took the emperor's authority into his own hands one last time. He informed the centurions and the tribune of the guard on duty that the emperor had ordered the immediate execution of his wife. This was a lie, a direct fabrication, but it was delivered with the full authority of the man who had commanded the state for the entire day. The soldiers, having no reason to doubt the emperor's chief secretary, complied without question. Narcissus dispatched a small execution party to the gardens of Lucullus. To ensure the order was carried out without hesitation or possibility of failure, he sent one of his own freedmen, a man named Claudius, to supervise the military officers. The arrival of the tribune and his soldiers in the gardens was the final, brutal intrusion of the state into Messalina's collapsed world. They found her lying on the ground with her mother, Domitia Lepida, sitting beside her. The scene was one of abject despair. Messalina's earlier fits of rage had dissolved into a state of continuous, exhausted weeping. The freedman Claudius took the lead. As a former slave himself, he had no regard for aristocratic protocol or dignity. He unleashed a torrent of verbal abuse, using the coarse, insulting language of the slave barracks to berate and humiliate the fallen empress. There was no pretense of a legal proceeding. This was a raw and brutal act of vengeance. Under this verbal assault, and with the silent, tribune standing over her, Messalina finally understood that there was no hope left. Her mother placed a dagger in her hand, making one last attempt to persuade her to take the honorable path of suicide. Messalina, her hand trembling, tried to press the blade to her throat, then to her breast, but her courage failed her. The tribune, seeing her hesitation and having his orders, did not wait. He was an instrument of the state, tasked with a clinical duty. He drew his sword and, with a single, efficient thrust, ran her through. The Empress Valeria Messalina, aged approximately 20-8, died on the floor of a garden pavilion, a victim of the same ruthless political machinery she had once so expertly wielded. Back at the palace, Claudius continued his meal. The news of his wife's death was brought to him at the dinner table. He was informed, simply, that Messalina was dead. He displayed no visible emotion. He did not ask whether she had died by her own hand or by the executioners. He did not inquire about the circumstances. He simply registered the information and, according to Tacitus, called for another cup of wine. His connection to her, so thoroughly severed by Narcissus's psychological warfare, had been cauterized with a final, chilling display of imperial indifference. The physical death of Messalina was merely the first step in a far more complex political process. The biological entity had been eliminated, but her memory, her 7-year reign as empress, her network of influence, her public image, remained a toxic and dangerous contaminant within the body politic. The narrative of the state had to be surgically cleansed of her presence. This was not a task for an executioner's sword, but for the formal, legal machinery of the Roman Senate. The process was known as the condemnation of memory, a posthumous punishment designed not just to punish the dead, but to erase them from the official chronicle of history. With the immediate threat neutralized, the Senate, which had been paralyzed by fear and complicity, was now galvanized into action. Eager to demonstrate their loyalty to the restored order and to distance themselves from any association with the disgraced empress, the senators convened. They did not act as a deliberative body weighing evidence, but as an instrument of the new political reality dictated by Narcissus and sanctioned by the emperor. They passed a formal decree. This decree mandated the systematic obliteration of Messalina's public identity. The first and most visible targets were her images. Statues and portraits of the empress had been erected throughout Rome and in provincial cities across the empire. These were not merely works of art. They were symbols of imperial power and legitimacy, physical manifestations of her role as the mother of the heir, Orders were now issued for these images to be taken down. Bronze statues were often melted down, the valuable metal recycled for new coinage or other public works, a symbolic transformation of a traitor's likeness into a utilitarian asset of the state. Marble busts and statues met a different fate. Some were simply smashed, their features rendered unrecognizable. Others, in an act of grim economy, were ravenous carved. The face of Messalina might be chiseled away and remodeled into the likeness of the next empress, her identity utterly overwritten by her successor. The second target was her name. In a society that memorialized its history in stone, public inscriptions were the permanent record of the state. Her name, Valeria Messalina, would have appeared on the dedication plaques of public buildings she had patronized, on the bases of statues erected in her honor, and on monuments commemorating the achievements of the Claudian dynasty. Teams of stonecutters were now dispatched to these sites, with hammers and chisels. They methodically effaced her name from the public record. The process left a conspicuous scar, a rectangular void on the surface of the marble. This empty space, the Razare, was a silent but powerful testament to her disgrace. It did not truly erase her memory. Instead, it transformed her name into an unmentionable void, a symbol of ultimate state minus sanctioned damnation. The erasure extended into the private sphere. Throughout her reign, aristocratic families, seeking to curry favor, would have displayed portrait busts of the empress in the atriums of their homes. These portraits were now a profound liability, evidence of a past allegiance that was now reasonless. These images would have been hastily removed, hidden away, or destroyed, as their owners scrambled to purge their households of any lingering association with the fallen empress. The ultimate goal of this state-sanctioned iconoclasm was to create a historical fiction. It was an attempt to retroactively edit the imperial narrative, to make it seem as if Claudius had never been married to her, and more importantly, to cleanse the lineage of her children, Britannicus and Octavia, of their mother's treason. They were to be seen as the children of Claudius alone, their legitimacy untainted by the woman who had borne them. By removing her name and image, the state was attempting to control the past, to enforce a collective amnesia that would secure the political stability of the present. Yet, the act of condemnation of memory is a profound paradox. In the very attempt to erase a person from history, the state creates a story that is often more powerful and enduring than the one it sought to destroy. The empty plinths where her statues once stood, the chiseled voids in the inscriptions, the very ferocity of the campaign to make her forgotten, all these things served to amplify her notoriety. They transformed her from a historical figure into a legend of infamy. The official state record could be cleansed, but the human memory, the unofficial history transmitted through gossip, rumor, and eventually, the writings of hostile historians like Tacitus, could not be so easily controlled. The Senate's decree, intended to silence her forever, instead ensured that the ghost of Messalina would haunt the Roman imagination for centuries to come. The formal condemnation of memory, for all its bureaucratic and physical violence, ultimately failed in its objective of erasure. In fact, it accomplished the precise opposite. The void created by the chisels of the state stonecutters was not left empty. It was immediately filled by a narrative, a ghost story constructed by Messalina's political and ideological enemies. This unofficial history, built on a foundation of rumor, moral outrage, and misogynistic caricature, proved to be far more durable than any marble monument. The state succeeded in destroying the woman, but in doing so, it created a monstrous and immortal legend. Her historical legacy became not the story of her life, but the story of her vices. This legacy was primarily authored by the senatorial class, the very group that had been most humiliated and terrorized by her reign. For historians like Tacitus, Messalina was more than just a corrupt empress. She was a perfect symptom of the terminal disease of the Principate. Every aspect of her story served his broader political thesis. Her dominance over the supposedly weak minus rule Claudius demonstrated the failure of one-man rule. Her alliance with the imperial freedmen highlighted the rise of an illegitimate power structure that subverted the traditional authority of the Senate. Her purges of the aristocracy were presented as the inevitable outcome of a system that had abandoned republican virtues. Her personal depravity was not just a character flaw. It was a metaphor for the moral sickness of the entire imperial court. Messalina was transformed from a historical actor into a powerful piece of evidence in his prosecution of the imperial system. While Tacitus provided the political framework for her condemnation, it was the poet Juvenal who cemented her image in the popular imagination. Writing his satire VI decades after her death, he was not constrained by even the loosest standards of historical accuracy. His goal was social commentary through grotesque exaggeration, and Messalina was his ultimate exhibit in his diatribe against the perceived moral failings of Roman women. It is from Juvenal that we get the most indelible and lurid images: the empress sneaking out at night to a reeking brothel, donning a cheap blonde wig to disguise herself, and working in a cell under the pseudonym Lycisca. His famous lines describe her as being the last to leave as the brothel minas keeper closes up, still burning with the fire of her lust, returning to the imperial palace weary, but not yet satisfied. This portrait, though satirical, became the definitive version of her story. It was more visceral, more memorable, and more shocking than the measured political analysis of the historians. It established Messalina not as a political figure, but as an archetype. The insatiable, predatory female, the whore empress whose ambition was merely a manifestation of her uncontrollable sexual pathology. This was a profoundly effective rhetorical strategy. It successfully conflated her political crimes, which were real and documented, with alleged sexual crimes that were sensational and largely unverifiable. Her ambition was not framed as a rational pursuit of power, which would have been a recognizable, if condemnable, male trait. Instead, it was presented as a uniquely feminine form of madness, rooted in the inherent weakness and corruption of her sex. This legacy of vice proved to be her most enduring monument. For the next two millennia, the name Messalina ceased to belong to the historical Valeria Messalina, the 20-8-year-old woman executed in the gardens of Lucullus. It became a generic noun, a synonym for a woman of extreme depravity and cruel ambition. She became a cautionary tale, invoked by moralists and artists to symbolize the dangers of unchecked female power. The specific political context of the Claudian court faded, but the archetype of the monstrous empress remained, a useful and endlessly adaptable trope. The ultimate tragedy, from a historical perspective, is that the woman herself is now almost entirely irretrievable. The sources are so uniformly hostile, so dedicated to the construction of this legend, that separating fact from propaganda is a near-minus impossible task. The condemnation of memory, in a perverse and final irony, did not erase her. It simply ensured that she would be remembered forever for what her enemies wanted her to be. The she-wolf, the literary ghost, had consumed the empress entirely. And so, the Chronicle of Valeria Messalina concludes. The main actors have taken their final bows, the bloody stage has been cleared, and the official state record has been sanitized. But what have we truly been observing here, in the quiet darkness? Have we been examining the life of a woman, or the construction of a monster? The stories of the nocturnal empress, of the contest in the brothel, of a lust that could never be sated. These come to us through the pens of men who wrote with a clear agenda. Decades after her death, they were senators and moralists, crafting a cautionary effigy to serve their own political and philosophical ends. Her story became a vessel for their anxieties about female power, imperial decadence, and the erosion of old traditions. The state, in its fury, attempted to erase her with chisels and decrees. The historians, in their contempt, ensured she would be remembered forever, but only as the monster they created. The real woman, the psychological entity that existed behind the imperial mask and the legendary pseudonym, is lost to us. She is a ghost haunting the margins of a hostile text. Her story, then, becomes a disquieting meditation on the very nature of history itself. It is a testament to the fact that the ultimate power is not the power to kill, but the power to tell the story afterward. We are left with a portrait of perfidy, but the canvas was woven and the paints were mixed by the hands of her enemies. The question that lingers in the silence is not what she did, but what was done to her memory. Her official memory was erased by decree of the Senate. Her true character was erased by the pens of her enemies. The record is now closed.